Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our Vendor Exit Strategies and Plans, Managing the Offboarding Process Safely and Effectively webinar. My name is Jessie Redmond, and I will be your host. On your screen, you should see multiple widgets that you can use, including Ask Question, Media Player, Slides, Related Content, Speaker Bio, Request Demo, and Help. If you are unfamiliar with our webinars, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide the widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of that widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. Don't worry, we do capture all questions throughout the session. We will answer some during the webcast, but those that we do not have a chance to answer live, we will address with you via email. Today's live session is eligible for 1 CPE credit. If you wish to receive this credit, please remember to be logged in individually with your own credentials, answer all 3 polling questions that appear on the screen during the presentation, be in attendance for the entire live 1-hour session, and complete the follow-up survey. We will send the link to the follow-up survey 24 hours after the live session concludes. If you meet all requirements, we'll send your CPE certificate within 7 to 10 business days following survey submission. With us today, we have Hillary Dewhurst, the Miners Head of Third-Party Risk Education and Advocacy. She will discuss vendor exit strategies and exit plans and cover the offboarding activities your organization should consider before exiting a vendor relationship. You will see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, links to our Offboarding a Vendor Toolkit, 5 steps for a successful vendor exit strategy ebook, the Essential Third-Party Risk Management Guide ebook, as well as a link to our library of additional resources, all in the Related Content widget. With that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Hillary. Hillary, the floor is now yours.
Well, hello everyone and welcome. Today we are talking all about exit strategies and plans. We're going to start off with just explaining why they're important and then emphasizing that importance by using some real-world examples. We're also going to walk you through how to identify those exit strategies and develop the plans, talk about some of the roles, responsibilities, and routines, and wrap up with some offboarding activities and key takeaways. All right, so the best place to start today is just by defining what an exit strategy is. And essentially, it's determining the approach that your organization will take in the event that you need to stop doing business with a particular vendor. That could be from the result of a permanent prolonged business outage, poor performance, poor financial health, or any other number of circumstances and events that necessitate the termination of that relationship. So right from the beginning, way before we ever sign the contract, it's important to identify what your company is going to do if they need to terminate this relationship. Now, it may seem strange to think about the end of the relationship before it's really officially begun, but it is an important part of planning for the future and making sure your organization and its customers remain protected. So when it comes to strategies, there's 4 common ones. The first one is to just simply replace the vendor. The second one is to bring that activity, that product or service in-house. Alternatively, you can just discontinue the activity. We're just not going to do that anymore. We're not going to have that product or service, or a combination of any of these methods. So if the exit strategy is what we're going to do, then an exit plan is how we are going to do that. It is basically the documented roadmap for getting through that termination process. And exit plans usually include, all the information about the vendor and the contract. It also thinks about who the stakeholders are, what specific risks are in that product or service, and thinking about dependencies, whether those are upstream or downstream, how changing or terminating or moving to another vendor might affect your organization and its customers. It really thinks about all the things we need to do in terms of tasks and activities that will help us complete that termination, and it outlines roles and responsibilities for both your organization and the vendor. It should always be realistic and achievable and include contingencies in the event the vendor can't or won't fulfill their responsibilities. All right, so the next logical question is this a regulatory requirement? Well, for most regulated industries, yes, it is. Now, keep in mind, you're not always going to see the exact terms exit strategy or exit plan in the guidance. But what you will see are the things they want you to consider. So that is starting off with your options. How do we transition to another vendor? What are the capabilities, resources, and time frame that would be required to do that? Any costs and fees associated with that exit? And how you're going to manage all the risks associated with things like data retention and destruction. You should also be thinking about how you might handle joint intellectual property, and most importantly, managing risks to the organization, including the impacts to customers. Now, even if you don't feel particularly bound by any regulatory requirement, having an exit strategy and plan is still really important. Now, I want to draw your attention to this great quote that says, at the onset of an emergency, everyone's IQ goes immediately to zero. And that is true. The best time to plan for a crisis or an emergency is not in the middle of one. We need to always be ready to act quickly if necessary. And waiting to the last minute can really result in a lot of additional stress and increase the risk of potentially loss or damage to our data or assets. We could end up paying more money. We could miss out on critical needs of stakeholders, just, altogether not do a good job at that exit. So getting that exit strategy together and drafting a plan is your best defense against some of those risks that can pop up at the last moment. All right, so the next question might be, when are these plans and strategies necessary? So ultimately, it is a good idea to at least have a strategy for every vendor that's risk rated moderate or above. But if you're dealing with a very large list, that may not be possible or practical. So if you do need to narrow your focus, it's important to really make sure you always have exit strategies and plans for critical and high-risk vendors as the bare minimum. You also want to think about your single point of failure vendors, where you don't have any alternatives, or any complex products or services. So maybe there's a lot of upstream and downstream dependencies. You also want to think about any vendor that helps you maintain regulatory compliance or vendor engagements where your organization has spent a lot of time or money to implement and maintain that relationship. So just like everything else, we want to use a risk-based approach so that we can really strike that balance between managing the most important risks and managing our resources. So some of you might be thinking, hey, isn't this basically business continuity? And the answer is no. Business continuity and disaster recovery are absolutely essential, but they're not enough. And to really dive into that, let's look at the specific purposes of, say, a business continuity plan that's really there to help you outline all the steps that it's going to take to get the organization back up and running after an operations interruption or some kind of disaster. Disaster recovery plans typically focus on protecting your systems and data after an interruption and getting them back online. But your exit strategy and plan really outline your approach to go away from that vendor relationship, Okay, so hopefully that clears up the difference between the three. Now, I want to recap just some benefits that we've talked about here. So the first one is making sure that you have a qualified replacement vendor who's actually able to serve your business. Making sure that you don't lose institutional knowledge. That can happen when people leave organizations. Keeping your operations safe, protecting your data, and establishing realistic and achievable timeframes, right? Not second guessing it. Making sure that you're planning for or reducing costs associated with that termination, avoiding confusion, identifying dependencies, and really confirming the feasibility of bringing an activity in-house if that is what you actually are going to do. And finally, meeting regulatory expectations. Now, while you think about all the benefits there, it is time to take our first poll. Jessie?
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we'll be happy to assist. As a reminder, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, you must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This poll question is, my organization requires defined exit strategies for all critical vendor engagements. Yes, no, for some critical vendor engagements, or not sure. Hillary, we have some time now to answer a question that has come in from the audience.
Okay.
Does vendor management review and approve exit strategies, or is that a management responsibility?
So this is a good question. Basically, when it comes to the third-party risk management team or vendor risk management team, their responsibility is really making sure that there are plans, that they've been submitted. The management for the business unit is really the ones that should approve the exit plan, because if you think about it, if something goes wrong with that product and service, they're the ones that are going to have to figure out what to do. So management approves, third-party risk management just make sure it's there and uploaded and reviewed. I hope that helps.
Thank you, everyone, for answering that poll question. Here are the results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Also, before we move on, in the Related Content widget, you can find our 5 Steps for a Successful Vendor Exit Strategy ebook. This is a handy, high-level overview resource to create a successful exit strategy. Be sure to grab it. With that, I'll hand it back to you, Hillary.
Okay, everyone loves real-world examples, so we're going to go through a few. Please keep in mind that we've had to change some details so that we can't really identify these organizations. But in our first example, we have a large national financial services company with multiple locations and branches, and they have about 75 mail rooms and delivery centers that moves all the interoffice mail and reports and receipts, and they also take care of lockbox services. Now, they've run an RFP. They want to save some money. A competitor comes in, offers them a great deal. They think, yep, let's take it. Sounds wonderful. We'll just hire all the existing employees to come work for the new company, and that will just create a seamless transition. But because they didn't do the work, they didn't understand that the outbound vendor had a non-compete clause in those employment contracts. And because by law they have to notify these employees that the contract's being terminated and their employment's being terminated 60 days in advance. So, of course, this strikes a panic in the employees, and they start leaving. Now, the inbound vendor is freaking out because now they have to staff up. And even though the outbound vendor decides at the last minute that they're not going to enforce these non-compete clauses, it's too late. They've lost more than half the staff. So now the bank has to step in and offer retention bonuses to the remaining employees and hope they can get them to stay and make the transition. At the end of the day, the transition costs are so high that they didn't end up saving any money, and they continue to have service interruptions and delays for months. Okay, so that is when an exit plan would have been really helpful. Now, back in the early days of cloud services, we're talking 2013 here, we had a major media company who's deciding to move its data to the cloud for the first time, and it selects a specific company that can offer a combination of 3 services, including gateway, private cloud, and public cloud services. Now, they move all the stuff over, and just 2 months after this happened, this cloud provider has declared bankruptcy. No one was expecting it, and they only give the customers 2 weeks notice to retrieve and move their data. Because no one had expected this to end so quickly. They hadn't even thought about their exit plan. They are now in a frantic rush and are competing with all the vendors' other clients to get assistance from the few alternative vendors that are out there that can help. So now they have to not only invest a lot of extra money and time to salvage their data, but they also lost data in the process. Okay, in this example, we have an insurance company, and they have been working with a vendor. They buy multiple products and services that are data analytics and management. Now, 2 of these products and services are high risk, and one that has been developed specifically for this insurance company is proprietary and is considered critical to their operations. Now, the sourcing and procurement team is really interested in diversifying some of that concentration risk, so they decide to award one of those high-risk services to a new vendor. Unfortunately, that was the moneymaker for the existing vendor, and this has created a big financial loss for them. They've had to start doing layoffs, and now they can no longer support that critical product that is proprietary. They also notify the company that they have to terminate the contract prematurely and shortly thereafter file for bankruptcy. So now the insurance company is left with no alternatives or transition support and is having operational interruptions that are really negatively affecting their customers. In our last example, we have a law firm, and they decide that they're tired of storing all the papers, so they are going to move to a digital documentation system. And they hire a contractor who's going to be responsible for selecting the vendor and overseeing the setup of the system that's going to automatically scan and store all of their documents. So the contractor comes in, they successfully complete the project, and now they've moved on, right? So the system's just running, it's going fine, they're getting paid every month, and everything's going well until there is a cyber breach. Now, client's data was compromised, and the law firm now has to look for a new vendor. But because they have not hired anyone to be in that position, they don't have the expertise to really define the specific requirements or figure out which vendors they should use or even know how long it's going to take. Additionally, the outgoing contractor of years ago really didn't leave a lot of project documentation, so the law firm isn't even aware that that document scanning system is actually reliant on another internal data system just to operate. So they're in a bit of a pickle. The point of all these stories is to really emphasize how important it is to think about these transitions before they ever have to happen and to do the planning and identify those dependencies, right? Each of these situations could have been avoided if they had had suitable exit strategies and plans in place. Okay, now that we understand all the implications of not having exit strategies and plans, let's talk about how to get them together. So the first thing, during that planning stage, when we're first thinking about this product and service, that vendor owner should really be working with the relevant stakeholders to come up with an exit strategy. What is going to be the best course of action? So again, our options are to replace. So we're going to select another vendor, but we have to have an alternative vendor identified and be sure that they can actually meet the same business requirements. In some cases, it may be more expensive to use an alternative vendor, and we need to factor that into the equation. The other option is to bring that activity in-house. So maybe, we did that data management internally before. We need to know that we would have the right staffing and resources to do that. Maybe we don't have those folks anymore. We'd have to rehire and train. And what else would we need to make it possible? Would we need physical space, systems access, additional equipment? And if we need all this stuff to make it happen, do we have the money to do that, right? Do we have to get additional budgets? Who would approve them? How long would that approval take? The next option is just to remove the dependency. We're just going to not do that activity altogether. So we're going to discontinue that product or service. So some of the things we'd have to think about is, do our customers depend on that activity? What are the upstream and downstream dependencies? That's people, processes, systems. How do these things connect to that activity? And then how would that activity being discontinued affect our organization? Would it affect our revenue, regulatory compliance, reputation, etc.? In some cases, you might think of a combination of these approaches, but you need to determine which strategies will be used and why, and is it a temporary or a permanent solution? So maybe we're going to bring a portion of it in-house until we can get another vendor, and then we'll move it back out. Or whatever it is, you still need to think about how that combination would be implemented and managed. Now, once we figured out what that exit strategy is, it needs to be documented and retained as part of that engagement record. So that documentation should include the individuals who were responsible for making that decision, their rationale for selecting that approach, and all relevant details on any alternative vendors, including information that was gathered from the RFP, anything that's going to make it easier and faster should we need to execute that decision. If it's coming in-house, we need relevant details on who's going to hire, manage, and train these folks, and we need a review date for the strategy. So we need to review this at least annually to make sure that everything is still viable, that vendor is still available, we still want to bring it in-house, we still know the dependencies, etc. And then any approvals to execute the strategy if necessary. So if it's critical, do we need the board to sign off, for example? Another important element in that documented strategy are your contractual considerations, right? We need to understand that the way the contract is written could potentially affect our strategy or our plan. It could result in more costs or other actions that we need to take or be aware of to have a smooth transition. So we need to review the contract to understand what the potential allowable causes for termination are. Can we terminate for cause or convenience? And if we terminate, are there any penalties associated with early termination? Some contracts are written to say, regardless of the cause, if you terminate the contract early, you're going to pay a portion of what would be expected until the contract ends, for example. We need to understand the termination notice period. So if it is 90 days, we need to work that into the plan. We need to understand the rights and obligations of both parties and how we're going to remediate any disputes. We also need to have a clear understanding on the levels of service that are going to be maintained through the exit, and if those are in the contract or not, how we treat intellectual property, return or destroy data, and get our equipment, assets, or facilities back. And don't forget how we're going to deprovision all the access the vendor has to our systems, data, networks, and facilities. Now, of course, that strategy is the what we're going to do, but now it's about developing the exit plan, how we are going to do it. So good exit plans always consider any costs related to that deconversion, stakeholders, roles and responsibilities, tasks and activities, time frames, dependencies, how we're going to get our data back, our assets and facilities back, and how we're going to revoke any access to those things. We also need to include communication plans and timing. So what are we telling our stakeholders? When are we telling them? Who is telling them? How we're going to manage issues, and most importantly, contingencies in the event that the vendor just cannot or will not meet their obligation. So let's go through some best practices. All right, so first and foremost, the very best time to develop that exit plan is when you're implementing the vendor's products or service. And the reason for this is that most times you're going to have some sort of project or onboarding plan that's going to help you go through all the steps and activities to get that vendor up and running. So do we need to connect them to our data or networks? What kind of access do they need? What kind of equipment are they given? How many employees are they going to have? All of these details that you're considering when you're bringing the vendor up are, in many cases, things that need to be reversed when you're terminating that relationship. So this is the optimal time to put this plan together. You also always need to identify your stakeholders and identify their roles in that termination. Will they need to review or approve activities? Will they need communication? Who is going to communicate? We also need to always think about, are we going to need help? Are we going to need additional resources? So maybe we are navigating a very complex vendor exit. Maybe they're connected to a lot of different data or networks. Do we need our IT or information security team to help with this? So we need to really identify that. Do we need extra budget, etc.? Okay, again, we cannot forget about our dependencies. Keep in mind that most products and services do not work in perfect isolation. In this example on the slide, I'm using a warehouse vendor. That warehouse vendor to operate has to get information upstream from either sales or distribution, and the warehouse then needs to provide additional information, maybe back to purchasing or manufacturing down the line, so that we keep the loop going. It's really important to sit down and map out dependencies so you don't accidentally break anything. Another thing is to be realistic about your timing. Please do not do yourself the disservice of just spitballing a time frame like, oh, hey, it's going to take 90 days. The truth is that some complex relationships take longer to unwind than they do to implement, and you need to be prepared to account for that timing and the actual tasks within that time frame. If you don't do that, you're going to be adding not only a lot of extra pressure to yourself, but to a vendor who has a lot less incentive to really support you after they've already lost your business. Finally, contingencies are essential. There are legitimate reasons sometimes why a vendor cannot support you through the transition as you had first imagined they would. Maybe their staff is left or whatever it may be. You need to have a plan in place to focus on what's most important when you're in triage mode to get that transition safely to the end. Okay, let's talk about roles and responsibilities, starting with that vendor owner. They are responsible for identifying the exit strategy and documenting the exit plan. They also need to be responsible for reviewing and updating that plan at least once a year and keeping it actionable and relevant until that relationship is done. Management needs to make sure that these plans and strategies are prioritized and that they're reviewing them when necessary and submitting them to the board for review when that's appropriate. The board should at least be informed of all the exit strategies surrounding critical vendors, or where anytime where a failed exit could really negatively impact the company or its customers. Okay, the third-party risk management team or vendor risk management team should be responsible for establishing the formal standards around strategies and exit plans and making sure that they're documented, approved, reviewed, and updated. They also need to make sure that they're accessible to anyone who needs them. So this becomes basically another third-party risk management deliverable that they will oversee. Subject matter experts may be necessary to ensure that key requirements are considered, or that nothing is left out, or that the plan is actionable. Sourcing and procurement teams, depending on your organization, may be the ones responsible for identifying those alternative suppliers or negotiating additional contract terms or conditions in the contract. All right, just to recap when to do these things. So we develop that exit strategy right at the beginning during the planning stage, and we document it. We also need to do the exit plan as soon as possible thereafter, right? Again, during that implementation stage so that we're capturing all the details. And it's important to understand that even the best plans can change over time. You know, details can change or directions can change. And that's why we want to make the requirement that there's a well-developed draft of the exit plan that is stored with the vendor record. That draft means that most of the work is done, and if termination becomes a reality, it's really just a matter of updating and finalizing the plan. Now keep in mind, both the strategy and plan should be reviewed and updated at least annually. And when there's any change to the vendor owner, during the midterm contract review, because if you're thinking about maybe changing vendors, terminating that vendor, you want to make sure that your ducks are in a row. And anytime there's a material issue with the vendors, such as performance issues, declining financial health, data breach, etc. Okay, so if all of this is new to your organization and you're in a third-party risk management role and you're thinking, how are we going to do this? I do have some ideas for taking kind of a stepwise approach here. So the first thing is to just sit down and determine the criteria that you're going to use to identify when an exit plan and strategy is necessary. So is it always our critical vendors, high-risk vendors, maybe it's certain products or services, it's financial thresholds, whatever it is that needs to be established. Then document the minimum requirements for both strategies and plans. And we do want to think about our governance documents, like updating our policy and our program documents and procedures to include these plans. So once we have that criteria, go through the list, identify who needs to have the strategies and plans, and then communicate with the vendor owners that this is a new requirement. You may need to do some training or education to support that effort. But one thing you can do is develop checklists or templates or even examples that are going to really help with vendor owners get the best result. You want to make sure you set a deadline for the vendor owners to develop strategies and plans for any existing engagement. So, hey guys, this is a new requirement. We're giving you 90 days to get this done. Here's how to do it, etc. Now, for all new engagements, you're just going to want to implement and enforce those requirements right away. You want to make sure that documented exit strategies are completed and uploaded before the contract is executed, and that those draft plans are submitted within about 60 days of contract execution. That's kind of a placeholder and a best practice. Some very complex things may need longer, but just make sure that that requirement is time-bound so it doesn't drag on. We always want to store the strategies and plans with the engagement record and set reminders to review and update them. And if there is an actual termination that's taking place, require that the vendor owners submit a finalized plan that's been approved by management if that is required at your organization. Okay, so we have gone through a lot on exit strategies and plans. Let's take a break for another poll question. Jessie?
Our second poll question of the day is, my organization has defined processes and activities required for vendor offboarding. Yes, somewhat, no, or not sure. Hillary, I have another question from the audience that we can answer.
Okay, great.
And that question is, do you recommend paying another vendor to act as a warm backup?
Ooh. Well, I guess it depends on what they're backing up. Oftentimes that can be an expensive and not wholly practical solution, just because you still have to go through significant transition activities to really move the business. But in cases like a cloud service backup, yeah, that might be a great idea. It just really depends on the product and service, and I would recommend, if you feel like that's an option, to really sit down with your subject matter experts and a pretty broad range of stakeholders just to really suss out all the requirements so that you could price that service effectively and then also make sure that you can manage it effectively. I hope that helps.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. I would like to quickly remind you that in the related content widget, you can find our Offboarding a Vendor Toolkit. This handy toolkit contains an ebook, infographic, and checklist. Hillary, back to you.
Okay, so we've covered exit strategies and plans, which are an essential part of your overall offboarding stage of the third-party risk management lifecycle. But it's really important to understand that we do need a standardized process to safely offboard any vendor relationship. So let's take a look at offboarding in general. Okay, so when we decide to end a vendor relationship, that can be for any number of reasons, right? Maybe our needs have changed, they haven't really performed as well as we want, maybe we need to end that contract prematurely, or we're just not going to renew it. So now what do we do? So it's important to understand that there are different types of vendor terminations. We have a planned or discretionary termination, right? We've made the decision to end it. It's expected, contract termination is aligned with everything. It's not a surprise, right? We have time on our side. We have time to do the planning, et cetera. And the vendor is cooperative and willing to partner in that exit. But we also have those unplanned terminations. So this is something that has to happen really quickly because we've had bankruptcy or other circumstances. We are not expecting it, and the termination may not necessarily be consistent with our expected contract terms. We have situations where the vendor may actually fire your organization because they've been acquired or they've been part of a merger and the new company is not really going to honor that product or service. In these situations, we don't have time on our side, right? So we're really thinking about triage and damage control. That's why our plans and strategies are so important. And the vendor may or may not be willing to partner in that exit. We also have what's called a partial termination, where we're just eliminating a specific product or service, but not the whole relationship. And there could be various reasons for that, but we may need to do some additional negotiation with the vendor in that circumstance. Okay, so the very first thing, no matter what kind of termination we're having, is to review the contract. And if you need help doing this, it's really essential to get your internal legal team or external counsel on this, because we need to understand the termination provisions. Do we have the right to terminate for convenience, for example, or does it have to be for cause? How soon in advance do we need to tell the vendor we're terminating? We might assume it's 90 days, but maybe it's longer. We need to check on that. who has to be notified of that termination. So do we have to send a letter to their attorney, to their head office? And are there any additional costs or fees? Does that contract have any stipulations about required service levels through a transition? If it doesn't, that's something we're going to have to account for in our termination plan. And are the roles and responsibilities clearly outlined? If not, something else we have to account for. Now, if a vendor is providing more than one product or service, make sure that you understand their internal dependencies. We used that example earlier about we got rid of one thing and it caused an unintentional domino effect. So it's important to really review the contract. We want to think about the cost and identify any costs. So are there going to be any early termination fees? If we're terminating for a cause, does that avoid us having to pay those? What are those specific costs? What is it going to cost not only to terminate, but other costs related to staffing or resources or additional time? What will the new vendor be charging us? Is it a similar rate? Are we going to pay more or less money? Are there any additional fees? So maybe they're charging us extra for transition costs or base service fees. And if we've prepaid anything, can we expect to get it back? Okay, once you have reviewed the contract and the cost, you need to really make sure that this is the right decision, because even in the best case scenario, there can be lots of risks associated with termination. And we want to just slow down and make sure we're actually making the right decision. And it means also considering if we've done everything to fix the relationship, especially if there were issues. If that vendor decides to litigate and you cannot prove that you've done everything to repair the relationship, you might be on the wrong end of a lawsuit. Now, as part of doing everything you need to do, make sure you have evidence that supports your decision to terminate, whether that's failed SLAs, documented discussions, whatever it is. I do like to always recommend that folks treat every termination as if there's a potential to go to litigation. I have seen it, and the bigger the organization is, the more valuable that business is to that vendor. There could be disputes. So it's really important to just make sure that you dot your I's and cross your T's, as they say. And now that you're ready to actually terminate, we need to rethink what service requirements we need during the transition, right? We need to make sure that we are including these in that revised plan, including the vendor's obligation to continue providing service at what specific level. Hopefully that's in the contract. Those roles and responsibilities. Maybe we need to have parallel services for a period of time. So we're going to have two vendors doing the same thing. And any additional assurances that we might need regarding confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the data during that transition to the new vendor. Okay, and we cannot forget about our data security and privacy. So we want to make sure that we are taking all the precautions that we need, including a way to secure and transfer all of our data or any other digital asset away from that vendor. If they're going to destroy it, we need to agree on what that method of destruction will be, and we need to be assured that the vendor has either destroyed that data or removed it and that they haven't shared it with anyone. So we are going to have to think through that as well. Okay, some best practices that go beyond what we've already covered are really more about the human interaction versus the business-to-business interaction. And the first one is to really have that hard discussion verbally, in person, if possible, with your vendor before you're sending off termination letters, right? It's just important to not catch people off guard and make sure they have a chance to ask any questions. You do want to provide that formal notification, and again, don't forget to copy your account rep or executive on that letter. No matter what, maintain good communication throughout the termination. Nobody wants to be there, but really maintaining that communication can just make it better for everyone. And the last one probably goes without saying, but you've got to keep it professional. No matter how egregious the behavior of the vendor has been or how poor their performance has been, it's up to you and your organization to kind of set and maintain that professional tone. All right, so once that formal termination has happened, it's time to execute your plan. And you do want to make sure that you discuss the exit plan with the vendor, or at least provide them a similar plan that has all of those detailed tasks and activities and timing. You want to make sure that you do have a discussion with the vendor and agree on how any issues are going to be communicated and managed. And don't forget to keep your stakeholder and management updated. And again, be prepared for contingencies. Now, I think it is time for our last poll of the day. Jessie?
Our third and final poll question is, have you ever experienced a vendor exit that went wrong? Yes, no, or not sure? Hillary, let's go ahead and answer another question from the audience.
I'm ready.
I am not sure I understand the recommendation for a draft exit plan instead of the final exit plan. Could you explain more?
Sure. So when we're first putting together the exit plan, it's really important to kind of suss out all the details that we would need, make sure we go through all of the requirements and considerations and stakeholders, and put it together in a draft plan. Now, the reason I don't say go make it final is because right before you're ready to actually go through with the termination, you're going to have to review it again, and it's more than likely that you may have to make some changes like updating stakeholders or add or change tasks and activities. So instead of trying to go through it with a fine-tooth comb and get it perfect, get it 90% of the way there and use it as that draft so most of the work is done when you have to go back and finalize it. The other reason is that you will want someone in your management team to go ahead and review and approve the final plan before you go about implementing it. So that's why you can work with a working draft until you're ready and then finalize it and get it approved. I hope that clears that up.
And here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. Before continuing, I would like to remind everyone that we have the Essential Third-Party Risk Management Guide in the Related Content widget. This resource guides you through the third-party risk management lifecycle stages in detail. Be sure to check it out, especially the section covering the offboarding stage. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Hillary.
Now, the very last thing we have to do, and it's not exciting, it's administrative, is that administrative closeout, right? So we want to make sure that we're carefully reviewing all the final invoices before we pay them to make sure there's no suspicious charges. We want to update the vendor status in all of the systems. So that's your accounts payable system, third-party risk management system, any sourcing or procurement, access management, whatever. For example, you don't want your sourcing and procurement folks inviting these vendors to bid on a project if they've been terminated for cause. So we need to update the status in all the systems. We need to organize all of the relevant documentation and keep it stored on nice and neat with the vendor record and keep it accessible for any audits or exams we might have, and of course, updating the vendor list. Now, after everything is complete, it always is a best practice to sit down and do a little sunset review. Really think about anything that you've learned about this termination or anything that could be done better in the future. So could your organization have done anything differently or better to get a better result? Were there any things that you might have missed along the way that if you had addressed earlier, you might have had a better outcome? And as an organization, did you provide good instructions and requirements for the vendor along the way? Keep in mind, it's a relationship and there's two sides to it. And if there's anything that you can learn from that termination and improve upon next time, just document it and share with the team. Okay, so key takeaways for today. Exit strategies and plans are essential for critical and high risk and complex products and services. We want to identify those exit strategies before we execute the contract and develop and document the plan within 60 days of contract execution. We want to make sure that we're reviewing and updating those plans at least once a year or as necessary, and making sure to communicate all of our requirements to the vendor owners and making sure that we're giving them the right support and assistance so that they can get these done. We want to make sure that the exit plan has always been updated and finalized before we start executing it, and we have to review that contract before any termination and follow the requirements in the contract. It's important to treat the vendor with respect, make sure the plan has contingencies, and don't forget about closing out your administrative details. Finally, that sunset review can really help improve things for the future. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jessie for some more information and Q&A.
Great, thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending. I would also like to thank Hillary for her time in sharing some important information. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On August 6th, our What You Need to Know About Vendor Business Continuity, Disaster Recovery, and Pandemic Plans. And on August 13th, our How Forced Parties Impact Your Credit Union webinar. We hope you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for those is in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Hillary, our next question is, if you cannot develop an exit strategy and/or complete an exit plan for each vendor, can you develop a template or general exit strategy and plan you can use across all vendors or across similar types of vendors?
So it's a great question, and the answer is partially yes. So not all products and services are going to have the same considerations. For example, a vendor who does not process, access, store, or transmit data is going to have a lot of different exit activities than one who does. So yes, you could fundamentally create some basic templates for certain product types and services, but I would not go ahead with the idea that that plan is comprehensive. You may want to put some additional requirements in around updating that draft plan with like additional details, maybe much further in advance in the termination process. My concern with doing sort of blanket things based on the product type and service is it doesn't really account for all of the sort of unique and nuanced details around the individual vendor you're dealing with or how the dependencies of the product and service are working in your organization. So checklists, basic templates are great. I think you can do it up to a point, but I wouldn't use it as sort of the end-all solution. I hope that's helpful.
Great. Our next question. Is it safe to define contingency and exit plans as a strategy or procedures for a fast-track process of moving out of an existing contract with a vendor?
Very similar to the last question in a lot of ways. Yes, I think that you can provide, probably 75% of that framework of sort of like procedures. But again, there's going to be those nuances that don't look the same from vendor to vendor or from product type or service type. So what I might recommend, it feels like for both of these questions, is really thinking about checklists that kind of cover all the things you want them to consider or, provide details on, as opposed to try and create just like a, one-size-fits-all package. There's a lot of value in streamlining these things, but again, the details that can make or break a termination or an unplanned exit are really so closely related to that vendor and how your individual organization interacts with that product or service. So I would be cautious when taking that approach. And again, I hope that's helpful.
Great. Next question. Do we need to go through the offboarding process if we are just discontinuing the relationship due to our contract coming to an end?
You do. I think, again, every termination is unique, but when we're talking about offboarding, we're talking about that formal termination process, right? Notifying them that the contract's not being renewed. We still have to do that. We still have to think about anything we have to turn off or get back or pay for at the end of that relationship. And if another vendor is coming on, we certainly have those considerations. But we still always have to organize that data and review final invoices. So yeah, the onboarding stage of the life cycle, the offboarding stage rather, is essential for any relationship. It's just what you will do, and the depth of those activities will vary. I hope that helps.
Great. Next question. Should your internal business continuity team sign off on exit strategies and plans for critical vendors?
You know, I don't have a recommendation one way or another. I know internal business continuity teams can vary. I've worked with several of them in my career. I do think it's a good idea to let your internal business continuity teams have access to or make them aware of the plans and strategies. Again, business continuity and disaster recovery are really solving for different issues, but there might be some overlap. So why I don't necessarily say they need to approve it or not, I think it's good to kind of think of them as like a stakeholder in the process. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Should low-risk vendors have exit strategies and plans?
You know, you don't have to have an exit strategy and plan for a low-risk vendor, and that's because by their very nature, they're low risk, right? There's not going to be a big impact to your company or to your customers if you end that relationship. They're not going to have access to data. You're probably not spending a lot with them. So just by their nature, it's probably not worth your time to invest all of these resources and energy into figuring out like how you're going to replace, one caterer with another. I do think it's important though to just make sure that you have a consistent and standardized offboarding process to make sure that all of those things are happening appropriately and that the relationship is getting correctly archived and everything is settled at the end. But I don't really agree that you would need to invest all that time in an exit strategy or plan for a low-risk vendor.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you, Hillary, for taking the time to address some of those that came in. Any questions we were unable to answer today, we will address offline. We would like to thank you all for attending and hope you found today's session valuable. Another thank you to Hillary for her time and great content. You can ask even more questions inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. Just because today's session has ended doesn't mean the conversations and questions must. Post your questions at thirdpartythinktank.com and see what your peers have to say. In the community, you will find thousands of free educational resources, including ones related to vendor offboarding. If you would like to become a member of Third Party Think Tank, you can register on the site or shoot us an email and we'll get you registered and send you a link to set your password. We did record today's session, and that recording link will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in the follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credit. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Thank you all and have a great rest of your day.